So Maureen O'Sullivan TD is chairing this session.
And thank you very much for the invitation to chair the session this afternoon. And I suppose when we look at the topic, democracy, can't but be struck by some of the things that James Connolly had to say about parliamentary democracy. And I was just looking at some of the quotes there. He spoke about the democracy of Parliament is in short the democracy of capitalism. It gives worker the right to choose his master, but the fact of mastership remains. And he had some interesting things to say about cabinets as well, that they're just formed by the numerically superior political party, and that we, the electorate, don't get much of a chance to say who we want actually in the cabinet. And again, interesting quotes that he talks about cabinets having full control of our destinies and possessing fearful powers. And I think that's rather relevant to what's going on today. I think the key word in the title today is genuine democracy, and we see the threats to our own democracy and threats to democracy throughout the world. The first speaker is Frank Connolly, journalist, and when I think of Frank, I put the word ethical with journalism, because I think we have too many examples of journalism which is not ethical today, and I have to always applaud Frank and the kind of the work that he has done. I'm always struck by the 2007 timing of Frank's article in the Mail about our previous Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, and then rather coincidentally, or ironically, or opportunistically, he went to the park very shortly afterwards to dissolve that Dáil. Being a supporter and canvasser and friend of the late Tony Gregory since the 70s, going around in that election in 2007, even though Frank's story had broken, the rumours, the talk was going around, we were so struck by the tremendous support for Bertie Ahern in Dublin Central. And, apart from anger, but also disappointment that in that election, Bertie Ahern got 12,500 first preference votes, and Tony Gregory, regardless of what you think of his politics, I think everybody could admire his integrity and his principles, he got 1/3 of that. But of course things have changed since then. So I welcome Frank, and he's going to speak to us now on his particular aspect. Has to do very appropriately, I think, with clientelism and patronage. Thank you.
It's the overall theme of this discussion is the question of building a genuine democracy. And I'm going to try and approach this issue through a discussion on patronage and clientelism, but perhaps not using the definition in the way that many people interpret it. Since the foundation of the state, there's been a culture of patronage and clientelism in operation at both local and national government level. Everything from farm grants, social welfare payments, public service jobs, from the post office to the Garda, and of course the other side of the coin, which involves getting your local politician to help with a planning permission or objection, a Garda summons or whatever comes under this heading. I don't need to remind this audience that this is not an Irish phenomenon, but it has its national characteristics, influenced as with many other factors of Irish political life by the legacy of our own civil war. The victors emerged with the spoils, including the cream of public appointments. The losers were forced to go back to their meagre land holdings and jobs where they could, or emigrate to Britain and the US in particular. In my own family's case, my grandfather on my father's side, who fought on the anti-treaty side, was forced to work in the car factories of Dagenham for decades after he was prevented from returning to his job in Carlow as general manager of a draper's shop when he refused to pass an official trade union picket in 1923. I mention him because he had fought with Liam Mellows, of course, whose biography by Desmond Greaves is one of the more important documents from that period. He was from Tuam, Milltown in Tuam originally, and was not the Martin Connolly that unfortunately joined the other side during that struggle. Of course, the tide changed when De Valera came to power in the 1930s, and the wheels of patronage began to turn in a different way, with those loyal to Fianna Fáil replacing many of those appointed by the previous regime, and over 3 decades of almost uninterrupted power ensured that the party influenced every aspect of local government and the public service. By the late 50s and early 60s, the dominant party ensured that its writ ran in every town and village, from the council foreman to the county manager, in an intricate system of appointments and patronage that in turn perpetuated the political survival and growth of the party machine. Meanwhile, those who did not benefit from this system were less likely to obtain secure and decent jobs, certainly in the public service, and more likely to join the hundreds of thousands forced on the emigration trail, again to England and America. Among those, incidentally, who left from Sligo in 1957 to find work in Luton was a young Tom Gilmartin, whose father had fought courageously in the War of Independence and later on the anti-treaty side in the Civil War, becoming, like so many of his generation, a fervent supporter of Dev. The party led by Dev and other leaders from the revolutionary period had transformed by this stage into a party that represented the interests of the wealthy in the main, and had already forged the relationships that joined Fianna Fáil at the hip with the emerging nouveau riche of business, and in particular of the emerging elites in banking, finance and property. The role of the party's secretive fundraising arm, TACA, in formalising this nexus between business and politics led directly to the scandals of the Ansbacher accounts in the 1970s, when the cream of Irish business were found to have hidden their considerable financial assets from the tax authorities in an elaborate Cayman Island offshore scheme, which was at one point run, you'll remember, from the offices of Ireland's biggest private company, Roadstone, in Fitzwilliam Square. That company's first chairman, of course, was Sean Lemass, former Taoiseach and party leader, while his son-in-law, Charles Haughey, and his accountant colleague, Des Traynor, played prominent roles when the details were played out in public at the McCracken Tribunal in the early 90s. Haughey was for many the quintessential embodiment of the growing culture of patronage and corruption by that time, and his promotion by various property and other business interests was best described to me during an interview I did in Zimbabwe with Patrick Gallagher in 1998, when he said that his father, the builder Matt Gallagher, believed that in the politician they saw the epitome of the new Irish confident ruling class that was throwing off the shackles of empire. This was the reason, he said, that his father ensured that Haughey was given a generous deal when he sold lands to Gallagher that were later rezoned in Edenmore in North Dublin, and that allowed the politician to buy the Gandon mansion that better fitted his image as a grand statesman. That was one way of describing the grubby zoning and land deals that benefited senior politicians at that time and for many years afterwards. And indeed a peculiar feature where a number of the more influential managed to acquire generous homes without having to go through the tiresome borrowing and mortgage process for housing that most families have to endure to get a roof over their heads. In more recent years, the same relatively small circle of powerful business interests explained in research by Task, the think tank, formed a web of overlapping directorships of banks, private companies and state positions that brought the patronage system to an even more sophisticated level, while helping to generate the seeds of the economic collapse that has wreaked so much havoc on so many Irish people since the crash of 2008. I mentioned Gilmartin earlier because so many years after his emigration in the late 50s, in the mid-1980s, he returned to Ireland as a successful businessman who had witnessed a new generation of young people migrating to Luton and surrounding areas to find work. He came back here to create decent jobs in his native country. What happened to him, as expounded in such shocking detail in the report of the Planning and Payments Tribunal last March, shows how the culture of patronage and clientelism had evolved into a sophisticated system of corruption that had infected, by the 80s and early 90s, senior levels of Fianna Fáil and the other main parties, the government, the public service, the Garda, the legal system, and, I'm sorry to say, the media. Let me take just a few examples of what has emerged in that corruption investigation over the past 15 years, and in which I have had some involvement due to my work as an investigative journalist and my exposure initially in the Sunday Business Post in the mid-90s of the illicit payments to former Minister Ray Burke, which in turn led to his resignation in 1997 and the establishment of the Flood and later Mahon Tribunal by his then party leader, Bertie Ahern. I was sitting in the press gallery in 1997 when Ahern complained of how Burke, a good man, had been hounded out of public office. Burke cried into his handkerchief when he recalled how the Sunday Business Post, me in particular, had brought his late father into the story by pointing out that the former Dublin North TD, known as the Bishop Burke, had acquired land from a mental patient where he worked as a nurse, and upon which a house was built for young Raphael and his family. It later emerged that the information was correct, of course, and the house was built by builders Brennan and McGowan in return for assistance given by Ray Burke, the estate agent, councillor and TD. It may have been a view of some of those in the Fianna Fáil PD government at the time that setting up a tribunal into planning corruption with such a broad remit might ensure that the inquiry would be obliged to follow a trail so complicated and so confused that it would be akin to a slow train shunted up a very long and endless track with no early end in sight and little collateral political damage to that government and its successors. They were right in some respect, until the investigation was obliged to concentrate on the peculiar financial affairs of Bertie Ahern himself, ultimately, as Maureen has pointed out, leading to his unexpected political downfall. The Tribunal of Inquiry focused on just a few years between 1988 and 1996 in relation to the Gilmartin or Quarryvale module, as it was called, but it also embraced the 3 years between 92 and 95 when Ahern served as Finance Minister. Most people who haven't had to read, as I have, the 3,000-page report of the Mahon Tribunal, and I don't blame you for not reading it, or who couldn't follow the various paths and trails over the 15 years, or in this more recent case, the 8 years of the Quarryvale investigation, can be excused for not really understanding what it was all about, other than that Bertie seemed to have been caught with his hand in the till. It's actually a fascinating story, if I don't mind saying so myself, in that it really goes to the heart of the discussion about a genuine political democracy and about the continuing role and what I have tried to trace back as the phenomenal growth of what we call patronage. Patronage sounds like a harmless word. When you see the infection of the actual state itself, the major political parties, and as I've said, the civil service, the public service, the Garda, the legal system and the media, we're really getting to the heart of the topic that we're discussing today. Let's take one sentence, one statement by Bertie Ahern during that particular period in 2006 when he was gradually coming under the investigation of the tribunal. He was asked when the story emerged in the Irish Times in September 2006 about the so-called monies he'd received. He replied that he had got dig-outs from his friends. But he also said during that period that he appointed these friends, or many of them, to state bodies because they were his friends, not because of anything they knew or any talents they had. That was a pretty central explanation. Of course, most people wouldn't have known the reason and the logic and the motivation, and indeed it has never been stated, I believe, publicly by anybody before, behind the so-called Irish Times exclusive story of the £100,000 on monies that the tribunal were investigating that went to Bertie Ahern. My view on it, and it is only my view, is that that story, looking back, was motivated by Ahern's desire to win a third term in the 2007 general election. That was only 9 months down the road. He knew, most of us didn't, in fact none of us didn't, because it was all in private correspondence between himself and the tribunal, which has now been released, that the tribunal had discovered a series of lodgements to accounts under his control and the control of his then partner, and accounts in the names of his children, his minor children. He therefore knew that at some point in the not too distant future he was going to be asked about these series of lodgements, all of which amounted to large round figure sums. He didn't know whether the tribunal was aware that a significant number of these payments were in sterling, were preceded by sterling transactions in the banks in which they were then lodged. And he didn't know whether the tribunal knew at that time that one of them